You're watching Public Affairs. Berkowitz is my name, and politics is our game. And we will be doing lots of politics and public policy because we have as our guest this evening John Tillman, who is CEO of the Illinois Policy Institute. That is a liberty-based research and education organization. I should say their principles are liberty, free market, transparency. And this is not what you usually hear from think tanks, although there are a few so-called conservative think tanks. But John Tillman has done remarkable work with that organization. He has grown it tremendously. When he came, I think there were 2 employees. There are now 12. Is that
12, right.
$100,000 budget to $1.5 million budget. If you want to find out something about John Tillman, as well as about the organization, the Illinois Policy Institute, just go to www.illinoispolicy.org. Got that right?
That's illinoispolicy.org, that's right.
And it's a very topical organization, very topical website. Stuff going up on their website almost daily, probably daily. And it deals a lot with state issues, whether it's state economic issues, well, I guess mostly economic issues, the state budget, taxing, spending, education, healthcare. Look, this is interesting stuff because we're taping this show on January 31st. By the time most of you see this, most likely it'll be after the election of February 2nd, although sometimes we go up on our website very quickly, and that's www, it'll come to me very soon, www.youtube.com/user/public-affairs-TV, or just go to www.publicaffairs-tv.com, and you can see all of our shows before you watch them in Chicago, in Aurora, in Rockford, in the 34 Chicago metro suburbs. More about everything that we've just talked about as we get into the show. But John, let's just start out with, you've been a big fundraiser this year. Would it be accurate to say that Blagojevich, Bush, and Obama have been the chief fundraisers for the Illinois Policy Institute?
That's a great way to frame it up. No, I would say actually Liberty has been the greatest fundraiser. Those guys are just side dishes. When I started on this,
they are appetizers.
That might be another way to put it. They've been delightful they've really changed the tone of the debate. But when I started doing this in July of 2007, I really wanted to focus on Illinois. My goal was to put a stake in the ground for liberty-based public policy principles, and I felt if we did that and did a good job with that, that we'd have good support from the donor community as well as the activist community, and that is exactly what's happened, regardless of the external things going on in the political scene.
But the excessive spending during the Blagojevich administration, the finding ways to spend without raising revenue, finding ways to be non-transparent, to hide things, I think I'm trying to be fair and balanced here, but I think most Democrats and Republicans would agree Blagojevich was doing all sorts of tricks. He was avoiding the legislature. So if he wanted programs and the legislature wouldn't approve them, he would just find a way to do it. One of the articles of impeachment was just that, right?
That's exactly right. And I think, as I always have liked to say about the Blagojevich situation is we don't need transparency at the end of a wiretap. We should have open government where people can see every transaction that's going on, everybody that benefits from it. It's the taxpayer dollars, and we should have a right to see how they're spent. And Blagojevich was a great evader of that, I think.
So either you have infiltrated the political drama that's going on in Illinois, or they have infiltrated you, because Adam Andrzejewski, who is one of the candidates in the Republican primary for governor, his big line is every dime on line.
Well, Adam's right.
Is that something you agree with, I imagine?
I totally agree with that. I think Adam's done a very good job. We started working with Adam in December of 2007 on transparency, and he's done a fantastic job with that. And we'll see how the primary turns out. But regardless of how it turns out, I think Adam has a place in Illinois politics going forward because he's been a great advocate for open government.
And you have a transparency pledge. You ask people to sign that. Many federal, state, and local legislators have, right?
Right. We send it out a couple times a year to every person in the General Assembly or running for office. And I forget the exact number we're up to. It's on our website, but a couple dozen now have signed it, and we expect that to continue to build as we go.
You didn't notice there any candidates for governor have signed that pledge in Illinois?
I don't know off the top of my head.
It didn't seem like they had, and I was surprised at that.
It's interesting.
What does that say? But basically, by signing that transparency pledge, people can find it. You can download it and read it very easily by going to illinoispolicy.org. But basically, what does it say, John?
Well, I think what it says is we're going to focus on that after the primary. We've kind of held our powder. We wanted to wait until the Democrats and Republicans had a primary. We'll be asking the nominees from both parties to adhere to transparency, and we'll send out our transparency pledge to them. And we'll focus on some other issues, budget and taxes, throughout the election cycle in 2010. I think we're going to see a great contrast. Whoever's nominated from either party, there's going to be quite a discussion that one side has a point of view that'll be very different from the other side. And I think it's going to make for interesting public policy discussion.
But basically, you're asking people to agree that they're going to take a pledge, they're going to try to make government more transparent. They're going to try to put everything online, put the budget online, expenditures, receipts, contracts. Yeah, I'm not quoting it verbatim, but that's the gist of what you folks are trying to do. Make it easier for people to find out about government.
We ask people setting public policy, elected officials, to commit to supporting any transparency legislation or policy. And to Governor Quinn's credit last year, and to the General Assembly's credit, particularly led by Mike Tryon, who was an early leader on this, Representative Mike Tryon, transparency bill did pass, and Illinois did put up the Illinois Accountability Portal, which is a good step in the right direction, but very limited. In December of 2009, we launched our own transparency site called OpenGov Illinois. You can link to it from our main site at illinoispolicy.org if you don't remember that name, and we've added to it. So we have every check written, every contract let. We have all the public employee pensions on there. You can go see Roland Burrs' very generous pensions he's gotten from the Illinois taxpayers. You can see salaries for every state employee. You can find out that the Department of Commerce in the state of Illinois spent $2,800 on hot sauce. They're spending $50-some million on automobiles. We post something on our website almost every day from that site that shows that the state is still spending money beyond what it should, given the financial crisis we're in.
Ralph Martieri, he is the executive director of the Center for Tax and Budget Accountability. Mm-hmm. He says, and has said for a long time now, we have a structural deficit in the state of Illinois. We have a revenue problem.
That is wrong. We don't have a structural deficit. We don't have a structural deficit due to a revenue problem. We have a deficit due to a structural overspending problem, and I can give you three quick, very specific examples of that. In 1998, we had 1.7 million people on Medicaid. Today, we have approximately 2.7 million people on Medicaid, yet the rate of uninsured has not gone down. And the reason is that Blagojevich's policies increased eligibility. So you have a family of four earning about $80,000 now getting taxpayer-subsidized Medicaid. That's structural spending that is now locked in. HighSpeed Rail is in the news right now.
So what you're saying, if the rate of uninsured has not gone down, it sounds like you're saying people who were previously insured in the private sector are essentially transferring over to the government sector at subsidized rates.
That is exactly the point I'm making. People are migrating out of private insurance into government subsidized insurance, and uninsured, it's changed half a point over those 10 years. Population did not grow, 3 or 4 or 5 points. Another example that's going on right now is a discussion about high-speed rail, where the state of Illinois is going to get money from the federal government to build high-speed rail. Well, no one talks about is that in 2, 3, 4, 10 years out, if we lock in high-speed rail spending now, we're locking in overspending that we can't afford today. We're already broke with it, depending on who you want to talk to, a multi-billion-dollar deficit, 6, 8, 10, 12 billion. Some people say a $15 billion deficit. I'm not sure I accept those numbers, but it's huge, whichever one you want to pick. And people want to lock in structural spending for high-speed rail that will have a very marginal benefit, if any benefit at all. And we think it will have no benefit.
Aside from the lock-in, so the point is, if you're putting aside from whether Illinois can afford to make these investments in the future, if you just look at benefit costs of high-speed rail, and I'm sure various economists have done it, and you've looked at that, do they show a ratio greater than 1? Do the benefits exceed the costs of investing in high-speed rail?
No, we didn't look at. We have a report out on high-speed rail. You can go to our site under transportation and find it. It's very detailed. It's written by Randall O'Toole, who's a transportation expert, and ironically a rail fan, and he's an extreme critic of high-speed rail because the economics don't work, the green aspect of it doesn't work. Cars are the Department of Energy's own report shows that automobile travel is more green than train travel. So you have tremendous infrastructure expenses, operational expenses that will all have to be subsidized going forward. And the money's not there to do it.
Supporters refer to other countries in Europe and elsewhere, and they say they have high-speed rail. Japan, they said the United States, to be competitive, has to do that.
I think it's ironic.
Do you think those countries are subsidizing something and making a mistake themselves, or are the conditions different that might make high-speed rail appropriate for those countries but not for the U.S.?
What we're talking about here, Jeff, is allocation of taxpayer resources, and what leadership has to do is set priorities and allocate very scarce capital dollars. Europe has allocated those dollars to high taxes for gasoline, which makes trains a little bit more viable over there, and then they put tremendous amounts of money into rail in general and some limited high-speed rail. Their economies are worse than ours. They have very little job mobility. They have very little job creation. It's very difficult if you're a European born to low income to become a high income person, and it's because their government is taking taxpayer dollars and allocating it to unproductive uses. We should not emulate them. We should reject that path.
Now, you know, people have been watching this gubernatorial campaign or participating in it, as you know. There have been two Democrats running, of course, Quinn and Hines. Quinn is the current governor and being challenged in the Democratic primary by Dan Hines. And there's now 6 Republicans running in the Republican primary. I started to say 7, but 1 has dropped out, Bob Schillerstrom. So again, that'll be decided, at least in each primary, on February 2nd, 2010, just a few days from the taping of this show. So you folks will know sort of who the combatants are. But the issues won't be resolved. So let's talk a little bit about that, about what's going on in terms of, is there a $12 billion deficit in the state of Illinois? Let's start with that.
Well, people who
before we deal with how to deal with it.
People are coming up with $12, $15 billion deficit numbers, and I think it's very misleading to present the deficit in that way. There is a tremendous deficit, but the way they come up with that number is they take all the revenues that are in the current budget that will not be in the next year's budget, and they add in additional costs that are going to come online next year that are structural spending, structural overspending, as I would call it. They add those all together, and it comes up to somewhere between $12 and $15 billion, and that's not the way a business does it. The way a business does it is, here's the revenue I expect, here's the spending I can afford, and you come out with zero. And the assumption of these 12 to 15...
Zero in terms of a deficit.
Surplus, because you only spend what you take in, or you spend less than what you take in. That's how we should be approaching this in the state of Illinois, as opposed to locking in a spending rate that we cannot afford.
But ballpark, what would you say the spending was for fiscal 2009, which is over with?
Somewhere around 26 to 28 billion, depending on how you measure it.
And that's the general revenue fund.
That's
not
the general
total
revenue
budget. It doesn't include federal funds, capital funds.
No, that would include federal funds. So out of the general, yeah, it does. The general
26 to 28.
Yeah, so the general, that was about 5, depending on how you measure it. Some of that was stimulus dollars, and some of it was ongoing recurring.
Well, no, but there are other federal funds that are matching funds that I think are not included in that.
But in the general revenue fund, own source revenue for 2009 was roughly $20 billion. And then in what they call transfers in and transfers out, there's about another $2.5 billion. So roughly $23 billion from own source revenue here in the state of Illinois. The rest of that revenue came from the federal government.
The other $4 or $5 billion that gets you.
Right.
But that's still the general revenue fund. And then there's a total budget, which runs about, as I understand it, $55 billion.
That's exactly right.
And what is the main difference between that total budget, 54, 55?
Transportation and other categories of revenues come in that are all dedicated, and that they're really locked in, and the legislature, without the general ongoing revenues, don't change a whole lot. The rates are locked in for things like the motor fuel tax and other aspects of revenue generation. So what people perceive and generally agree that the legislature has the greatest influence over is the general revenue fund. That generated about $22 billion, in rough terms, $22 billion last year, and that total budget last year was somewhere around $26, $27 billion.
And looking forward to 2010, and we're, well, I guess we're halfway through fiscal year 2010. Right. What do you think the projected revenue is as of now for that general revenue fund? For the coming fiscal year?
Right. Well, for the year we're currently in, the projection is that it's going to be about $900 million short of what the original projection was.
Which was, and the original projection was?
The total was about 27 billion in total revenues, and the projection now is that'll come up about $900 million short.
So there's that hole for the current fiscal year.
That's right.
Although people make it sound a lot larger, and you're saying that's what it is, $1 billion. So adjust spending in this budget would be in balance, adjust spending by about $1 billion down. Is that what you're saying?
What I'm saying is we should freeze spending at the 2006 level, which ironically is almost exactly to what the current budget is, which is roughly $27 billion. We should freeze spending right about there. That'll take somewhere around $2.5 to $3 billion in spending reforms and cuts to do that. And then it all depends on how much federal revenue comes in and what own source revenue generates, whether we start to see growth in sales tax receipts, income tax receipts, corporate tax receipts, and all the rest of it. But the bottom line, you know, instead of getting into the esoteric details of the budget, it's a simple question for your viewers, which is, our revenues have been going down because this state in particular, worse than most states, because our state is hostile to economic activity. What should this governor be doing, or the future governor going to be doing, or what are the candidates who are going to run for the election in November, what are they going to propose to raise what I call organic revenue growth? There's two ways to generate revenue in a state. One is to treat taxpayers as tax targets and raise rates and fees, or to try to get more taxpayers and more businesses who pay because they start a business and hire people. This state is very hostile to that. We ranked 48th out of the 50 states in job creation, and that's a reflection of our entrepreneurial activity. We need to make this state...
But Governor Quinn has said there are hundreds of thousands of jobs that he's creating right now. Doesn't he say that?
He does, but he is creating all those jobs, but ironically, all those jobs are in the government sector or dependent on the government sector, and that is
But he would claim otherwise. I mean, Ford has recently, just as we speak, come in and talked about either expanding a plant or opening a plant, doing something that's creating, didn't they say something like 1,200 jobs?
Yeah, that's true. But that's
Okay.
the point is we're 48th out of 50 states over the last 10 years in creating jobs.
So Quinn has to do multiple of those Ford examples I just gave to really ratchet up the number of jobs created by the private sector.
No, I reject that. The whole point that Quinn's point of view is conveying is that it's the government's job to be the Machiavellian character manipulating the economy to try to create jobs. That's a failed strategy. What we should be doing is taking the speed bumps out of the highway of prosperity that lets entrepreneurs start and create a business and hire workers. What we do through our regulatory scheme, workman's comp, unemployment insurance, the tort bar here, taxation, we have the seventh highest debt burden. All those things create burdens to entrepreneurs starting a business in the state of Illinois. And it's proven by the government's own data that we rank 48th out of 50 states in job creation.
So you're saying that sort of the business roundtable of Chicago and Illinois and of the country, they're wrong because they talk about government providing incentives, say in the local area, Daley and Quinn getting together, giving incentives as they call it, lowering taxes as a special break to Ford. They'll come and locate there, then they can claim new jobs.
Right.
You're saying those little special things are wrong, they're gimmicks? Am I getting that right?
That is what I'm saying.
That is what you're saying. Yeah,
yes, there could be isolated cases where that works, but those are just, all that is temptation and seduction. What really, when you create prosperity is when the overall situation is conducive to somebody starting a business, an entrepreneur taking a risk to start a business, an investor investing in them, and the worker wanting to partner with them to create value for customers. And when they're successful in creating value for customers, that business grows. And it grows organically because they're creating value for customers. All those things you just talked about that too many governments are focused on, those are just trying to tempt people in non-economic ways to start a business by creating a taxpayer-directed subsidy. They're picking the winners and losers. That's not what the government should be doing. They should be lowering the barrier to entry.
So you're saying that if our current levels of spending of revenue projected $27 billion, they really don't require much adjustment from the normal growth of spending, if you want to call that normal growth, the projected rate of growth of spending. For fiscal year 2011, you're saying people were projecting, reasonably or not, maybe spending of $30 billion, 31. So if you had this revenue that you're talking about on track, we're got about a hole of about 3 to 4 billion, not 12 billion.
I'm not sure I followed your numbers. I'm not sure I followed your numbers exactly.
I'm trying to get at how did you get from $12 billion to we only need to deal with a $3 or $4 billion hole? That's what I'm trying to get at.
Well, now that if you have 27
because John,
billion
you're making news here. If you can persuade everybody in Illinois, we don't have a $12 billion deficit. We got a $4 billion deficit.
That's probably. I believe we have somewhere, if we're going to use the way most people talk about this, we have somewhere between a $4 and $8 billion deficit, depending on what you do with the pension situation and what you're doing with ongoing spending and what you do to opt out of the structural spending increases that the federal stimulus program created. But my point
that
is,
gives you a lot more leeway. Now we're up to $8 billion. That's.
But my point is, it's the wrong way to look at it. The right way to solve a budget deficit is last year is last year. What happened happened, and you start the dial up new. So if you ran over last year and you had a deficit, let's say we have a carryover deficit of about $4 billion in unpaid bills from one year to the next. You park that number there, and then you start to figure out how can I get my current year to be in balance.
And what do you do with that $4 billion carryover? You borrow?
Well, we'll come back to that.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm going to try to keep this. I'm going to try to keep this simple. Okay, I want to try to keep this simple.
Okay.
You have the carryover debt. You have to deal with that. The bottom line is the first step is how much money do you have coming in, and how much are you going to spend? And we should spend less than what's coming in. That's not how people are discussing this $12 to $18 billion deficit. They're locking in spending. And what I'm saying is you can't do that. And that's why we're going to come out in March with a very specific proposal that'll show department by department where you can cut. And we're going to make somewhere between $2.5 and $3 billion in spending reform and cut recommendations, combined with our pension reform proposal. We'll put the budget in balance without a tax increase. combined with some asset sales and perhaps some limited borrowing. We'll see if that's necessary in the end by the time the study is done. But we believe that you can go forward without a tax hike.
Would you agree with Dan Proft, one of the candidates for governor in the Republican primary, says we should cut the individual income tax by 50%, also cut the corporate tax by 50%?
If we implement our overall plan that we're going to be outlining in the coming weeks, I believe you'll ultimately, in the long run, be able to eliminate the income tax. So I think cutting the income tax in half is a step in the right direction.
All right, and Prof wants to sell, as he says, initially it's going to take a while for that short-term positive, for the long-term positive impact of those tax cuts to kick in. So in the short run, cover that partly by selling the lottery or leasing the Illinois lottery, which is, as he says, an $8 to $10 billion asset. You don't necessarily spend that all or use that in 1 year, but that would soften it.
We're going to
agree with Prof on that?
I agree with that conceptually. Not only the lottery should be on the table, I think it's immoral for the government to be in the gambling business. I think I have no problem with the gambling laws as they exist here and the fact that we have casinos here. I'm not advocating for more casinos, but I think that is the way it is today. But for the government to be a gambler at the taxpayer's expense, extracting cash from many people who can't afford it and being a willing participant in that as opposed to just siphoning off tax dollars, I think it's immoral, and the lottery should be leased or sold, and I think the tollway system should be on the table. The government should focus on core government services for those who desperately need help through no fault of their own. We are a compassionate society, as Governor Quinn likes to say, but it should be very, very limited and very, very temporary when possible.
So the government, again, Prof, this show is not about Prof, and it'd be interesting to see if Prof wins because, you know, we're using him as a model. But it does seem like a lot of Prof's ideas, proposals track your ideas. He is a free market kind of guy, liberty-based guy.
Well, Dan
so there would be the reason for there to be some consistency between the Illinois Policy Institute and Dan Proft in terms of ideas, right?
Dan is a policy wonk, and he has thought about it a lot, studied a lot, and written about it for a very long time. And he is his own man in that regard, of course.
And he talks about big-ticket items to reform: education, healthcare, education, pensions, and transportation. I call them HEPT, okay, for the acronym. You would agree. Those are 4 items that you're working on at the Illinois Policy Institute in terms of proposing reforms, right?
That's exactly right.
And probably education is where you've done the most. School voucher, school choice, charter schools, that sort of thing?
Yes, on February 5th we have a luncheon with Reverend Meeks, and we have a policy panel that morning discussing school reform here in Illinois and vouchers, which we're very excited about.
Reverend Meeks appears to be supporting Pat Quinn for governor in the Democratic primary. Is he being fair and balanced and also supporting a Republican? Because I don't know that Pat Quinn has talked about school vouchers, and many Republicans have.
Yeah, I haven't paid any attention to Reverend Meeks' political endorsements. What I'm excited about is that Reverend Meeks has recognized that the way to help people in his district is by giving parents more choice over the educational choices for their children. One of the best tools to do that frees children to pick the best school in their own interest is vouchers, and he's embraced that, and we think that's an exciting turn in the public policy debate on educational reform.
All right, and you know there are people who are opponents of vouchers like Ralph Mortieri. They say the evidence shows that vouchers don't work. He cites 2 various government-supported studies, big funded programs that he says show school vouchers don't work.
Ralph,
what do you say to Ralph about that?
I say, Ralph, you're wrong. There are many studies that demonstrate that vouchers work well. And besides, think about it for a minute. If vouchers didn't work, parents
Let me just say, and I threw that out there because Ralph does say that the main study he refers to, not a voucher program at all. Right. Private schools. He's simply comparing various private schools to public schools. That to Ralph is a voucher experiment. With those private schools not getting vouchers.
Yeah, almost all the, as somebody might say in the global warming debate, and all the peer-reviewed, credible studies on vouchers, they work extremely well. Choice improves outcomes. It's true with charter schools, which are public schools operating within the public school system, but not under the collective bargaining agreement.
And in fact, this is a social justice thing, because you want to focus on low-income people who don't have choice, give them school vouchers.
It
they
is
would
absolutely
have similar choices to Barack Obama and other wealthy people.
How ironic is that, exactly? And
because Barack Obama, we should say, does not and has not sent his kids to public schools, I don't think at all. In Chicago, it was to the lab school. Now it's private schools. What is it? Sidwell.
Right.
Schools that charge like $30,000 a kid or something.
Meanwhile, Barack Obama's endorsed the closing down of a voucher program that were benefiting kids going to the very same school his children are now going to.
A bit hypocritical, you say?
I would say that's very hypocritical, and it's a tragedy in my view. But the point about Ralph is if vouchers don't work, people won't use them, so what do you have to lose? Parents make the best possible choice they can. Vouchers create a measure of accountability. Right now, parents are locked into failing public schools if they don't have the income to opt out by paying their property taxes either through rent or home ownership, and then paying tuition as well. From a social justice point of view, the zip code you're born into shouldn't determine whether or not you have a fair chance at a good education.
And yet all the Republicans running for governor, you say, talk and promote and support this in concept, but only Dan Proft has laid out a program and really committed to school vouchers.
Well,
We don't see it in any of the other candidates. They all say, oh yes, vouchers are nice, but you don't really have any confidence that if Andy McKenna or Jim Ryan or Bill Brady gets elected,
no, I have high confidence.
Folks are actually going to promote school
I actually
vouchers?
have high confidence that the Republican nominee, whoever they are, will look favorably upon vouchers. But Dan's long been passionate about this issue.
Look favorably as opposed to will there be school vouchers or a substantial program of school vouchers 4 years later as a result of any of those Republican candidates
as you know, Jeff,
getting elected as opposed to Dan Proft?
As you know, whether Dan's the nominee or somebody else is the nominee, and Dan has a passion for vouchers and other people will pursue vouchers, whether that law passes or not is a complicated question. But my point is that the Republican nominee, I believe, will embrace vouchers and promote them.
All right, pensions, that's a big deal. $83 billion unfunded liability for the state of Illinois for public sector pensions. You say you've got a solution?
We do.
The Illinois Policy Institute?
We do have a solution. You cannot fix Illinois' economic decline, and we are in economic decline.
And let me just preface it, we only got 4 or 5 minutes, so be quick.
I'll be quick. You can't fix our economic decline without fixing the budget problem. You can't fix the budget problem unless you fix the pension problem. The way to fix the pension problem is to solve the fundamental problem that's put us on the edge of the precipice, about to go off the cliff, and that is overspending, as I've been saying throughout the show. We need to implement a spending limit of
statutory or constitutional?
Initially statutorily, ultimately constitutionally, and it has to be done constitutionally.
What's that limit?
Inflation plus population growth. The last 20 years, that's averaged 2.4%. Revenues for the state in the General Revenue Fund have averaged 4.8% over those same last 20 years. So we use that in our model going forward. Whether we get there in the first year or two, we don't know, but we're going to use that as a model going forward. You limit the growth of the General Revenue Fund to inflation plus population. You take money over that, the surplus money over that as the economy recovers, and you make the annual payments to pensions. And then once the annual pension payment is made, you take the money and put it into a very modest budget stabilization fund. Once that is done, which only takes a couple of years, you begin to refund the money back to taxpayers. By 2045, we'll be able to refund $690 billion back to taxpayers while having the government live within its means with that spending.
2.4% a year growth in total spending for the state of Illinois.
Correct.
People would laugh at you. Many Democrats and and actually many Republicans. So you're not accounting for capital projects, whether it's schools that need help with construction, whether it's transportation, a variety of other roads, bridges. You can't spend that at a normal 2.4%. You need a capital plan, as they came up with $31 billion. John, Mr. Tillman, you're saying you're against that $31 billion capital plan?
Well,
you want to see Illinois starved of jobs?
As usual, the way to create jobs is to limit the growth of government to its core services.
Forget jobs. How do you get those capital projects taken care of?
You fund the cost of those capital projects, and if you're going to take on debt for capital projects within that growth of 2.4%, if you have to take
you can do it, you think?
Oh, there's no question you can do it. And our study will show that when we come out with that in March, and your viewers will be able to come and see it.
We're going to continue to speak as the credits roll, but I very much want to thank our guest, John Tillman. Thanks so much for coming.
I appreciate it.
John Tillman is the CEO of the Illinois Policy Institute, an organization that has grown rapidly under his tenure. What is it, 2 or 3 years there? 2.5 years. Been very fortunate. Been treated well. You can find out more about it at www.illinoispolicy.org. I mean, we're about debate. We like to have people on the left, on the right, conservatives and liberals. What we want to see in the state of Illinois is not just politicians, but think tanks, left and think tanks right, think tanks liberal, think tanks conservative. Clash of ideas. Out of that comes good solutions. You agree? I do agree with that. Now, you have to have an open dialogue about the public debate, public policy, so people can get educated on it and make their own choice. Close on health care. What do you do? People are saying you just got to expand Medicaid. That solves the problem. You disagree? I disagree with that. We have a study on our website called Dire Prognosis. You can see bullet point. What are the 3 or 4 things they have to do in Illinois? Well, in Illinois, we have to ramp down eligibility, and we can't have people making $80,000 getting taxpayer-subsidized health care. You have to eliminate mandates so that you can lower the cost of health care, and we should be able to buy from any of the 50 states. And nationally, can you eliminate the 45 million people who are uninsured? Do you want
You
to?
could. If you go to our site, you can see
You
steps
provide
to-
insurance, not eliminate them. You provide insurance.
we have a proposal called patient-centric healthcare. We partnered with 32 other state think tanks to talk about how that would work on the state level.
But it's not Obamacare?
It is not Obamacare.
That's why Obama.